I believe we can all identify Sprint as the massive telecommunications corporation worth billions, listed among Fortune 500 companies. Back in 2019, over 50 million users depended on their cellular network, which means plenty of viewers here have interacted with them personally. The next year saw their competitor T-Mobile officially purchase them in a deal valued at $26 billion. Since then, T-Mobile has discontinued the brand, terminated the network operations, and essentially Sprint exists no more. It feels peculiar to consider that one of America's 4 major wireless providers, present throughout my lifetime, has simply vanished. I can confirm this organization wasn't performing well financially. In fact, numerous industry experts thought that without the buyout, they were probably heading toward bankruptcy proceedings or financial reorganization, making them a questionable investment choice and generally experiencing difficult times. For more than 10 years, Sprint had been hemorrhaging funds, fighting to keep subscribers, and frankly, people weren't particularly fond of them. Consider this. The American Customer Satisfaction Index, following a poll of roughly 220,000 individuals, positioned Sprint significantly lower than the other 3 major wireless providers. However, I believe you'll find that Sprint has had a fascinating and influential journey. For this presentation, I want to explore how everything grew so large and where things went so wrong. Origins. This organization remarkably traces its beginnings to the 1800s, technically existing before Alexander Graham Bell's telephone patent. It essentially began as part of railway operations. The Southern Pacific Company set up telegraph wires alongside railroad tracks, allowing dispatchers to stay in contact with train operators. These were eventually converted to telephone lines. For roughly 100 years, AT&T essentially controlled every aspect of the telephone business. But during the 1980s, authorities required them to separate their regional telephone operations, which started changing the landscape. Naturally, numerous companies spotted this opportunity, creating somewhat of a rush in the long-distance sector. This motivated Southern Pacific to utilize their current infrastructure to build a long-distance system they ingeniously called Southern Pacific Railroad Internal Network Telecommunications, or simply Sprint. Quick favor, if you found this video interesting, subscribing helps us cover more rise and fall stories like this. Kindly do please. Merger Marathon. You probably already understand that because of costly infrastructure and economies of scale advantages, the telecommunications sector revolves around mergers and buyouts, and this situation exemplifies that perfectly. I think Sprint's narrative can be effectively communicated by emphasizing some of the significant mergers. Beginning in 1982, GTE purchased that initial Sprint network. They controlled 16 regional phone operations, and since those local services needed to link with long-distance networks for those calls, the strategy was they'd now benefit from managing both segments. Then in 1986, that combined entity merged with United Telecom, forming an equal partnership that United Telecom eventually completely acquired in 1992, when simultaneously everything was renamed to just Sprint. United Telecom also originated in the 1800s. It was launched as the Brown Telephone Company, named for its creator, intended as a local option to AT&T in the small community of Abilene, Kansas. Through the years, it expanded to additional areas, purchased other regional companies, rebranded several times, and by this merger was a multi-billion-dollar enterprise that had poured resources into building an impressive 23,000-mile fiber optic system for long-distance communications. Do you understand what was occurring? Neither organization was making money when they united, and together they only controlled 4% of America's long-distance market, still overwhelmingly dominated by AT&T. But they were putting money into their infrastructure and scaling operations, hoping to create something that could gradually become profitable and take market share from AT&T's enormous portion. And that's exactly what happened. Fiber optic advantage. By the late 1980s, they were drawing sufficient customers to finally generate profit for Sprint. Everything centered on that fiber optic system. It was their major marketing advantage because no significant rival, including AT&T, was employing that technology. They created a new logo with horizontal lines meant to symbolize fiber optics and showcased it in a successful advertising effort, where a pin was notably dropped beside a telephone, claiming the fiber optics allowed hearing even that tiny noise completely across the phone connection. Another significant merger occurred in 1993 when Sprint joined with Sentinel, making them the first major provider to offer local, long-distance, and cellular services together. That was Sprint's first major entry into wireless services, which clearly became an enormous industry segment. Wireless wars. By the middle 2000s, Verizon Wireless and Singular each had more than 40 million subscribers, partially because Singular had recently purchased AT&T Wireless. Like I mentioned, there have been countless acquisitions to match their competitors who were aggressively expanding in wireless markets. Sprint made their own purchase in 2005. They acquired the wireless provider Nextel for $35 billion, changed the corporate name to Sprint Nextel, and introduced a new yellow logo that I'm sure we all remember, since they kept using it until the very end. Nextel disaster. I understand this transaction seems like a sensible choice, and that's what many observers thought then. But reviewing it now, it's commonly considered one of the most disastrous acquisitions in history, and quite possibly the primary reason for Sprint's collapse. Honestly, this whole presentation could focus on how Sprint and Nextel were incompatible. They operated different technologies, so they couldn't gain advantages from merging networks, resulting in wasteful infrastructure and terrible customer experience. Their company philosophies were essentially polar opposites. Nextel was quick-paced and dynamic, while Sprint was a conventional, cautious telephone provider. They faced major problems with affiliates. Sprint had given them exclusive selling rights for Sprint-branded products in specific regions, but then Sprint began marketing Nextel offerings in those same areas, which was questionable. This sparked numerous legal battles, and in many instances Sprint determined it was simpler to purchase the affiliate instead of fighting the lawsuit, so they invested nearly $15 billion doing that in the years after the acquisition. Even the promotional efforts failed. They kept marketing under both Sprint and Nextel names, so when they began promoting them as Sprint together with Nextel, it created confusion. Many Nextel leadership departed, and the CEO stepped down in 2007 once things deteriorated. If you'd invested $100 in stock at the acquisition's conclusion, you'd have under $20 remaining 5 years afterward. Downward spiral. In 2008, they documented a goodwill write-down of almost $30 billion, essentially acknowledging that Nextel hadn't maintained its worth and that most of the $35 billion they'd spent for it years before was squandered funds. In 2013, they formally terminated the Nextel network and removed Nextel from their branding when that year a Japanese corporation called SoftBank mostly acquired them. It was actually the biggest overseas purchase by a Japanese company, paying slightly over $20 billion, which is clearly substantial money. But I want to emphasize that Nextel alone was purchased for $35 billion without even considering the Sprint portion, demonstrating how much worth they'd lost during that period. To elaborate further, back before Nextel was ever part of the picture in 1998, their rival WorldCom was on an acquisition campaign and proposed paying $115 billion for Sprint. The Department of Justice blocked it, fearing diminished market competition, and it was seemingly an excessive valuation regardless. But using those reference points, Sprint technically shed almost $100 billion in worth over those 15 years. America's most disliked provider. I think it's reasonable to say that Sprint earned the poorest reputation among major wireless companies. In 2017, they appeared at number 10 on Yahoo's ranking of America's most despised corporations, and the next year they were on USA Today's ranking of America's most despised companies, this time at number 7. Like I stated initially, people really didn't like Sprint, and I'll argue this mainly stems from not having the strongest network. I completely acknowledge there might be some previous Sprint users viewing this will challenge that, and I'm willing to listen, but I'm guessing far more of you are already agreeing. It's unfortunate to mention because this is Sprint we're discussing back when everyone worried about long distance. They were famous for their superior fiber optic, pin-dropping, ahead-of-the-curve network. But sadly regarding wireless, it's an entirely different situation. Returning to the American Customer Satisfaction Index in 2019, research focusing exclusively on network quality also ranks Sprint considerably behind other major companies. Though I should mention that despite being a multi-billion-dollar Fortune 500 enterprise with over 50 million users, Sprint was genuinely the smallest major provider. So it would be logical that the smallest business would have the weakest network. Additional problems. But there are clearly larger factors too. Obviously, that Nextel purchase consumed so much time and resources that I'm confident you'll agree should have been directed toward building and enhancing the network. Also, when creating new 4G technology, Sprint was burning additional money by choosing to develop WiMAX rather than LTE that eventually became the industry standard. I can't claim expertise about the technical specifics, but their WiMAX network shut down in 2015, essentially meaning they gambled on incorrect technology. Near the conclusion, Sprint was still attracting fresh customers while losing many current ones, suggesting they were drawing new people through discounts and introductory offers, but then losing them once that special pricing ended. This made profitability very challenging and overall isn't a viable business approach. Final chapter. In 2014, Sprint actually attempted purchasing T-Mobile again. There were compliance concerns, but 4 years later, it was permitted to occur in reverse, in a transaction that required roughly 2 years to complete. To obtain approval, Sprint had to transfer their prepaid operations to Dish Network for $1.4 billion, which included Virgin and Boost Mobile. At this stage, I hope it's clear why a transaction like this perhaps needed to occur. After being so triumphant and noteworthy in the long-distance industry, they made some expensive errors when moving to wireless, from which they never fully bounced back. Let me know in the feedback section what you think about Sprint. Again, there's much to admire in the early period considering their long-distance achievements, and even going back to the 1800s and how they expanded while building infrastructure. But that Nextel deal was such a terrible choice. Do you think most of their troubles trace back to that? Or are there other elements I should emphasize more? Also, to former Sprint subscribers, what's your opinion of them? Did they deserve placement on those most hated lists? Or was your experience more positive? Any additional perspectives you have about Sprint, share them in the feedback. I'd appreciate hearing your views. Thank you for watching.